Welcome to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm Matt Levitt, the director of the Reinhardt Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence, and this is the latest in our counterterrorism lecture series. Before we start, I'll ask everybody to silence their phones. I'll lead by example, and we'll get right to it. It's a real pleasure to have with us today John Fernandez. John is the DEA's Assistant Special Agent in charge of SOD, the Special Operation Division's Counter-Narcoterrorism Operations Center, CINTOC. And in this role, he oversees an interagency effort to support field investigations specifically concerning Hezbollah's global criminal support network. Previously, he worked for 2 years as staff coordinator for the center. He also worked for the DEA's office in San Jose, Madrid, LA, and as an intelligence analyst with the CIA's Africa and Latin America division. So it's a real pleasure, John, to have you here to discuss the DEA's targeting of Hezbollah's global criminal support network. I'll ask you to come give your opening remarks, and then we'll field questions and answers from our seats.
Thank you, Dr. Levitt, and thank you to the Washington Institute and you, Matt, for inviting DEA here, and thank you, Matt, for your years of counterterrorism work both in and out of the government. I've had the privilege of participating in a couple events with Matt in different places, Columbia, Israel, Georgetown University, and it's always been a great experience, and I always learn a lot from you, so thanks for having me here. You know, with the current events going on in the news, I think it's very timely, this policy forum. So again, thank you for having me here. As Dr. Levitt said, I'm with the Counter-Narcoterrorism Operations Center, one of the sections at SOD. The CINTOC is one of SOD's sections, interagency operational support and coordination center, interagency center, with the Five Eyes partners. Co-located with us at that center, and a whole alphabet soup of U.S. government agencies. The section, CINTOC, was formed after the terrorist attacks of September 11th in order to try to fill those intelligence gaps between the law enforcement, intelligence community, Department of Defense, military, et cetera, and in order to bring to bear all resources and authorities of all agencies. At the center, the CINTOC, we have FBI's Counterterrorism Division represented there, HSI, Treasury's FinCEN, and OFAC, and we have CBP, we have DOD entities there. Of the 68 FTOs, foreign terrorist organizations designated by the State Department, DEA has linked 25 of those to some form of drug trafficking or role in the drug trade. If you notice, IRGC was added last year in 2019. Now, we're a counter-narcotics agency, but because of the drug terror convergence and the lucrative nature of the drug trade, we, of course, cross over to the CT realm on a regular basis. And in this crossover, we have primarily two roles. The first role is when we come across purely terrorism information, we pass that off completely to the relevant U.S. government agencies that have that mandate, the counterterrorism mandate. And this information has been extensive, with literally hundreds of reports that DEA sends over to our ISC partners. And a lot of this information involves, possible terror plots, kidnappings, force protection threats to our military overseas, kidnappings, and other national security-related intel. The second role is the convergence role. When a DEA drug case and a drug investigation crosses over to that CT realm, we'll coordinate with the relevant agency partners, but we will proceed with that criminal investigation in order to remove those counterterrorism actors from the playing field through other criminal charges that might be more feasible than terrorism-related charges. Some of those crossovers are shown in this Venn diagram in the center. And the targets of the DEA cases that we support are usually those center convergence targets, the ones that straddle those overlapping worlds of terrorism, crime, drug trafficking cartels. And it's important to note that DEA does not initiate purely counterterrorism cases. That's not our mandate. We initiate drug-related investigations, which, due to the drug terror convergence that I'm talking about, often lead us to these convergence targets, and that's where we live. As such, these cases may ultimately result in drug or terrorism-related charges, depending on where the evidence leads us. So we're following the evidence. So we may not end up with drug trafficking charges or whatever. We might end up with material support charges, or conspiracy to kill Americans, or arms trafficking. And we've had numerous successes with those investigations. After September 11th, the USG, through such vehicles as the Patriot Act, sought to increase our whole arsenal of authorities and resources. Again, to remove those players from the playing field by any means possible, any charges possible. One of the ways the U.S. government increased its resources against terrorism was by adding the 960A narco-terrorism statute to Title 21. And the Title 21, the Controlled Substances Act, is our primary law that DEA enforces. And the 960A narco-terrorism enables us to expand our it expanded our authority in order to go after narco-terrorists. And we've had a lot of success using this, and, along with charges I mentioned, arms trafficking, conspiracy to kill Americans, etc., Title 18s. And we have been able to remove terrorists and their criminal financiers from the playing field. You know, the Taliban drug lords that our BIU unit has taken off, targets like Mansour al-Khazar, Ali Kolat, etc. Hence, DEA, as I mentioned in the introduction, has a critical role in the USG's overall fight against terrorism. And this is part due to one of the things that we're most proud about is due to DEA having the largest U.S. law enforcement presence overseas and, most importantly, a unique, vast, and extremely well-placed global source network. These quotes I included here in these screenshots here, I think underscore this point. Both General Hayden, former director of CIA and NSA, in his book from 2016, cites the human intelligence skills as second to none of DEA. General Mattis, more recently in his 2019 book, made a specific reference to that importance of the drug terror convergence and the critical role that DEA has. He talked about his quote there is a reference to the foiling of the assassination attempt by Mansour al-Babsiar, the IRGC agent, who they were trying to assassinate the Saudi ambassador to the U.S. in D.C. here in 2011. And when al-Babsiar reached out to what he thought was a hitman they're trying to contract from of all places, the Zetas cartel in Mexico, it turned out that was one of our informants. DEA Houston did that case, phenomenal job they did. And we were able to foil it by engaging our partner agencies that deal with that kind of stuff. And he mentions there, absent one fundamental mistake, the terrorists engaged undercover DEA agent, who was actually an informant, in an attempt to smuggle the bomb. The Iranians would have pulled off this devastating attack. Had that bomb exploded, it would have changed history. And, you know, I point out some other examples down there below just to kind of drive home the importance of DEA has because of this crossover. It was often said that during the invasion of Afghanistan after 9/11 in 2001, the military benefited from the vast source network that DEA had in Waziristan and Pakistan and Afghanistan, drug source network, because of the crossover with the Taliban, because the Taliban was funded by heroin, et cetera. So that helped the U.S. military, is my understanding, with a lot of their engagements with the Northern Alliance, et cetera. There are specific and pretty neat stories about U.S. military lives being saved directly through intelligence that DEA passed after we established an office in Afghanistan and started working drug cases against the Taliban, et cetera. There were a lot of drug wire intercepts that were done. And a lot of times those drug wire intercepts would come across, frequently, and intelligence from our sources of where specifically IEDs were planted, where ambushes were being planned, where troops were supposed to be lured to, booby traps, etc. All of those saved many lives, many U.S. personnel lives. The extensive terrorism information that we pass on a regular basis that I mentioned earlier, and also just the cases, which some of them I'll talk about here, the cases into these convergence targets. The DEA is targeted through criminal cases, Hezbollah, Taliban, ISIS, FARC, and ELN, the narco-terrorist groups in Colombia. So one such convergence narco-terrorist transnational criminal organization that we target, as I mentioned, is what we've dubbed Lebanese Hezbollah. Lebanese Hezbollah's Criminal Support Network, and I'll refer to it as LH throughout the briefing here. And we describe this officially as the Logistics Procurement and Revenue Arm for Hezbollah, or LH, and by association for Iran. And again, I'm speaking to a lot of you guys who are subject matter experts, a lot more than I am on this topic, and so I'm going to be stating some of the obvious here. But I just want to mention the following to put into context and to drive home why Hezbollah as a TCO, as a transnational criminal organization, is very unique for a target for DEA, a drug agency. First of all, as you all know, again, I'm stating the obvious here for you guys, Hezbollah, sophisticated first world intelligence organization, very high skill level with counterintelligence and intelligence, operate as a state actor with the way especially with the way they've hijacked a lot of the political system of in Lebanon. They're very hierarchical, compartmentalized system, very sophisticated with their political, military, social wings, the Islamic Jihad, ESO wing. And this has been an issue with some of our allies where, because of this compartmentalization, as you know, the U.S. government has an ongoing effort to try to convince some of our allies around the world to designate all of Hezbollah as a terrorist organization rather than just a military wing like a lot do. And as you guys know, there's been some success with that, with Paraguay, the UK, and Argentina designating this year. But anyway, that's again, this is a unique criminal organization in that sense. They operate as a traditional organized crime group, just like the Italian mafia or Pablo Escobar's cartel. When it comes to making money, they don't care about sectarian differences or religious differences, etc. We've seen them working with Sunnis, Christian criminals, Sunni criminals, and even the Jewish crime syndicate in some investigations. What makes them unique also is they've killed more Americans than any other foreign terrorist organization before 9/11 and possibly since 9/11. And as you all know, of course, they're a major proxy for Iran, part of its Iran threat network with its military wing deployed to Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere, Yemen. So, as you know, Hezbollah being used in Iran's expansion and its influence in regional destabilization. As the U.S. military refers to it, some of the folks we work with, the Shia Crescent there, stretching from Lebanon to Syria, Iraq, Iran, and all the way around to Yemen. And they're doing this, as you know, through its alliances with the Assad regime, Russia, and proxies such as Hezbollah, the Shia militias in Iraq, and the Houthis in Yemen. And finally, the other trait that makes them a unique target for DEA is the national security prioritization that's been given to them in the whole Iran threat network by our current administration. The administration, the President Trump, has taken robust steps to counter this threat and wants everything in the USG's arsenal used against it, every tool, resource, and authority. This has been underscored by the U.S. military support to Iran's opponents in the proxy wars, through U.S. sanctions, Department of Justice's designation of Hezbollah as a priority transnational criminal organization in 2018, the State Department's designation of IRGC as an FTO, and the launching of its Rewards for Justice program in 2019, and the presidential executive order broadening OFAC counterterrorism designation capabilities. So I say that because a lot of times when you're in briefings or meetings, folks will say, wait, you're a drug agency. What are you doing, in this realm? Please go back to the children's table. So we say, this is why, and with the reasons they're talking about. The president wants all resources, and as I've shown, DEA has a crucial role here. So due to these unique traits, the expansion of LH's criminal support network across the globe and the uptick over the last 10 years of DEA cases hitting into this network, the primary mission of the SINTOC, where I'm at, has become supporting all DEA field investigations into what we're calling LH's Global Criminal Support Network. And all of these cases fall under what we call Project Cassandra, which I think you've seen in the news. So, the Global Criminal Support Network. Hezbollah receives the majority of its funding from Iran, as everybody knows. But as Iran has been strained with the sanctions and its role and losses in the regional proxy wars in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Hezbollah has increasingly turned to criminal proceeds. And it should be noted that Iran's funding stream to LH is believed to also be commingled with criminal proceeds from the IRGC's own criminal activity, as well as illicit proceeds from Hezbollah's criminal support network that make their way back to Iran's coffers. Hezbollah's criminal support network taps into the global Lebanese diaspora. It's all over the world, six of the 7 continents. And this network consists of Hezbollah members, affiliates, sympathizers, non-LH Lebanese criminals, as well as other nationals and criminal organizations. So what Hezbollah is doing is, from what we're seeing, is tapping into the criminal specialization of different criminal groups: money launderers, drug traffickers, arms traffickers, businessmen that are in violation of sanctions, in order to supplement the funding they're getting from Iran. From our assessment, the criminal support network dates back to at least the 1990s, when it was established by Imad Magnia, an ESO member, and involved in the Marine barracks bombing in 1983, to supplement that funding it was receiving from Iran. And then that network expanded following Hezbollah's financial strains caused initially by the 2006 war with Israel, and now with these other proxy wars. Many of you already know of DEA's initial cases into the network that began about now 13 years ago, long before I was ever in the SINTOC, with Operation Titan. The Shekri Harb and Francisco Flores Upegui connections to the La Oficina de Envigado cartel in Colombia, the Ayman Juma ties to Colombia, and then, of course, following that, the ensuing Lebanese-Canadian bank case in 2011 that culminated with a $150 million seizure by DEA in 2012. And more recently, the joint DEA-European Operation Cedar case into LH's European cell of its criminal support network that was taken down in 2016. So when my fellow agents who preceded me first identified the ties between LH and traditional transnational criminal organizations like the Colombian cartels, they then knew what to look for. Now they knew there was this tie, and so they started looking for it. And they started diving deeper into areas where this convergence could be found. And as a result, they were able to illuminate where where these criminal activities were taking place, such as free trade zones and areas where Lebanese diaspora was present. Hezbollah-connected money laundering networks, for example, they were competing for money laundering contracts, just like any other criminal organization, from Colombia, from Colombian cartels, et cetera. And they were running these elaborate worldwide money laundering schemes everywhere: South America, tri-border area, Venezuela, Colombia, West Africa, Europe. And it should be noted that since then, DEA has never stopped pursuing LH's criminal support network since they first identified it in 2007 with Operation Titan. And this is regardless of any of the foreign policies of any previous administrations, et cetera. DEA is a law enforcement agency. They follow the evidence. They follow criminal activity. They don't start out looking to target LH. They target, like as I said before, they start out targeting traditional drug trafficking cartels, and they follow the evidence where it goes. And the evidence has taken it in this target set to Hezbollah directly. And then as I mentioned before, we pursue the charges relevant to that evidence, regardless of whether they're drug charges or CT-related charges. And we continue to successfully conduct these cases against this target set. Oops, this is so. Here's a snapshot of some of the earlier. I didn't realize I had that clicking thing. A although it's kind of cool. It makes us look like really busy. This is a snapshot of some of the earlier case examples from about 4 or 5 years ago, which many of you are already familiar with, and which followed the Operation Titan LCB cases. And there are several more from this period, but for different reasons we can't show them here. Some are related to ongoing cases, et cetera. These all resulted in the arrest and extraditions of significant drug and arms traffickers, money launderers, and terrorists, as well as the seizure of numerous assets. These specific field cases, I want to kind of give a shout out to some of our guys, were spearheaded by phenomenal and outstanding agents working in our New Jersey offices, Miami, New York, the Paris country office, the Hague country office, and other European regions. And also SOD's own Bilateral Investigations Unit, or we call BIU, and that's our enforcement field office that's at SOD. Some of these you might recognize, and we can, discuss it later in Q&A if you want. Operation Cedar is represented here with the arrest in 2016 of Mazen al-Attat, arms trafficker, money launderer, drug trafficker, Mohammed Nuruddin, Ali Zabib, Hassan Trabulsi, and then you have the related arrests or indictments of Mohammed Ammar and Ghassan Diab. And we have some of the New Jersey cases into Ali Kolalat, Ibrahim Amadoun, Rio Salazar, arrested in Colombia, the tri-border area arrest of Ali Shamas, Ali Fayyad, Kanani, Mansour, Miami cases. BIU was Ali Fayyad, and BIU, our SOD BIU's unit, did the cases on Jordan Vanden, El Shout, Ali Khalifa. And I think some of you had followed some of this in the news, so I won't belabor that, and we can talk about it later if you had questions. But DEA's objective, just to underscore it, is to disrupt and dismantle LH's criminal support network. The objective is to do this by removing the most prolific drug and terror convergence targets and other network criminals from the playing field and impeding the illicit revenue flow to LH through criminal investigations and prosecutions and indictments with arrests, extraditions, and seizures of related drugs and assets. The Qasim Tajuddin cases I wanted to talk about. In addition to providing our operational and analytical support to field cases, a lot of times in the SynTalk we'll depart from that and initiate and conduct investigations that will then team up with the field office to work with them, but we'll lead the investigation. And that's why I'm especially proud of this and wanted to highlight it since it's an adjudicated case. I can talk about it more than I can some of the others. Basically, the SynTalk financial investigators that we have, a phenomenal group of guys, they started looking at Qasim Tajuddin because he was an OFAC designee and because of his ties to some of the other investigations we were doing. That's one of the benefits of our close working partnership with OFAC is that by simply being a designee, you now have the basis for additional criminal charges. You now have a starting point for criminal charges when you're, when you wouldn't otherwise. Because now you just have to find where are they violating that designation. And that's what they did with Tajuddin. We knew he was a major financier of Hezbollah. We knew he was designated in 2009 because of his financing of Hezbollah. And sure enough, the financial investigators were able to identify a vast and pretty elaborate scheme of him masking his illegal transactions in violation of the OFAC sanctions. So this is one of those cases where we were actually in the lead on it rather than just a support role. The SynTalk financial investigators initiated and led the case. They gathered the necessary evidence. We worked with CBP and FinCEN and OFAC closely, coordinated with DOJ attorneys, indicted the case, identified assets and related probable cause, and we seized millions of dollars for the DEA field. We were even involved in the tracking and arrest of Tajuddin overseas. So the SynTalk investigators have initiated other similar cases against LH's criminal support network that I can't really go into here, which are ongoing and being worked with the field. But they're using extensive financial triage and analysis, which have already directly resulted in multiple sealed indictments, as well as pending indictments, arrests, and seizures. These are separate investigations from the Tajideen one. And some of these cases focus on LH-connected targets involved in the massive global used car trade-based money laundering that we've heard a lot about that was being done through West Africa over the years. So we're excited about those coming to fruition. And as I mentioned before, as I said, our close collaboration with OFAC designations, this has been one of the most effective tools in the USG's efforts against this network, and we've had a lot of success with it. So our ideal approach in going after the network is we like the 1-2 punch of coinciding a criminal indictment with an OFAC designation. That's always great, and we did that with Mohammed Nuruddin and sort of with some other targets where it was kind of staggered a little bit. But with Mohammed Nuruddin, it was a beautiful coordination on the morning of the French and the European allies and DEA over there in Europe did the arrest on the European charges there on the same morning that we are coordinating with OFAC to launch the designation. And that's ideal what we like to do. But if we can't get an indictment, then a great bird in the hand approach is the designation. I mean, it hits them in the wallet, it isolates them from their associates, it exposes the network for its criminal nature and thereby discrediting LH leadership. And as I mentioned before, it provides as a basis for other criminal charges going forward just by having that designation. So we really value our partnership with OFAC. Getting towards the end here. So this is a snapshot of where Hezbollah's criminal support network is operating and where DEA investigations are focused. As I mentioned before, we got the 6 of the 7 continents we're seeing them operating on. These investigations are being conducted by several different DEA domestic and foreign offices, often in conjunction with interagency law enforcement and foreign counterparts. So as you can see there, just kind of giving a nutshell overview, South America, we have the historic ties to the Colombian cartels, first identified by us in 2007. We have in Venezuela, extensive and historical ties between Ahmadinejad and Chavez, and continued with Maduro, the president there. Intelligence that we had on IRGC and LH training Venezuelan security forces. Venezuelan government officials involved in air shipments of cocaine to Syria with the help of the Iran network. We have all sorts of drug trafficking, money laundering, Venezuelan officials helping LH and IRGC get fraudulent passports from Venezuela. It goes on and on, very deeply tied. And that was, as you remember, in 2018, the designation of Tariq al-Assimi in that last slide. He was the vice president of Venezuela, and DEA contributed pretty extensively to that designation. So you have Venezuela, you have the tri-border area. Of course, everyone knows the long history of Islamic extremism in that area. Hezbollah's criminal network is thriving there. We've had some good cases there, some good arrests, extraditions. I mentioned Ali Shamas before. And then even with Mexico, we have a couple of indictments of very significant targets within the network that had been involved in money laundering with Zetas and the Colombian cartels, and even shipments of cocaine from Colombia to the U.S. through Honduras and Mexico. So West Africa, of course, the extensive used car trade-based money laundering that was discovered or highlighted in the Lebanese Canadian bank case, that it was tied to used cars in mass being shipped from the U.S., and that was part of the money laundering scheme for the Colombian cocaine proceeds that were being laundered out of Europe by Hezbollah-controlled money laundering networks. And we've seen the money laundering in Australia, drug money laundering, front companies, exchange houses in Asia, and of course in Europe, the Operation Cedar takedown highlighted their extensive operations there using the luxury goods and jewelry and luxury car trade to mask a lot of the money laundering coming back. So following the I wasn't able to, I can't mention a lot of the ongoing cases like I said, but just to kind of give you an idea, following those aforementioned case examples that I showed you on that other slide, since 2017, DEA's efforts against the criminal support network has resulted in an additional 17 indictments, 14 arrests, 3 extraditions, 9 OFAC designations, and that's not including the over $50 million that we were able to seize from Tajideen during that case. These targets, again, included drugs, arms traffickers, money launderers, financiers, sanction violators, and terrorists. And on the immediate horizon, we have coming up, hopefully soon, 4 pending arrests, key arrests, 8 pending indictments, 4 pending extraditions, and multiple upcoming designations with our OFAC partners. So we're excited about that. The following are examples of how we measure the impact of our efforts against this network. And they also underscore how Hezbollah as an organization benefits from the revenue generated by this criminal network, and the extent to which Hezbollah as an organization benefits from these criminal proceeds, and the extent to what level of Hezbollah leadership is witting or condoning or directs it has been the subject of debate among analysts and agencies and countries for many years. But I think, maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but I think that the view that criminal proceeds are making it to LH coffers, I think that's becoming more widely accepted. I think just the evidence is just becoming more prevalent. But again, I know it's subject to debate. So where we get our assessment, we try to make it completely fact-based. We try to simply rely on investigative evidence, extensive corroborated information from well-placed sources, and other intelligence and analysis from partner agencies and allies. And we also try to be careful about making assumptions, and when we label targets within the network, try to make sure that we don't just jump to conclusions or label them all as Hezbollah members, because we understand there's a spectrum. There's members and affiliates, and then sympathizers, and then unwitting people whose activities are being used in furtherance of or to benefit LH, but they're not even witting. So we understand that important distinction. Examples of that evidence: Operation Cedar, when that was taken down. Following that, obviously I can't go into detail about how we know some of the stuff, but following that, there was extensive and very telling evidence where we could tell that the revenue stream there that we impeded was impeding other capabilities of Hezbollah, and we took that as a win. Following Tajideen's arrest, and actually during the arrest, when he was arrested in Morocco, while he was pending extradition, and we knew that every time we've had an arrest in this network in whatever country it is, almost without fail there'll be enormous pressure of some type, and sometimes with the threat of violence, on that host country government that is holding them pending extradition to the U.S. So we knew as soon as he was arrested in Morocco, with the amount of money that he generated for them, we knew there was going to be political pressure and maybe something else. And sure enough, there was. There was enormous political pressure from Iranian-tied elements and LH-related elements on the Moroccan government, including reports of extensive bribe offers, et cetera. And to the credit of the Moroccan government's great courage in this, because they were risking a lot, they did the right thing. And they not only extradited him, but expedited it in the interest of justice. And as you know, Iran actually severed diplomatic ties, not solely because of that, but as we understand it, it was in part due to that snubbing. But we're forever grateful to the Moroccans for that. Ali Fayyad, and again, the point of that is, if his money isn't going to be making it into Hezbollah or Iranian coffers, why would they go to such lengths to make that kind of pressure? Ali Fayyad, drug trafficking related arms trafficker tied to Russian arms suppliers. He was the subject of a DEA undercover operation by our BIU group. He was arrested in Prague with 2 associates in 2014, I believe it was. And while pending extradition there, he orchestrates with Hezbollah elements in Beirut to kidnap, I believe it was 3 Czech military intelligence officers. He uses that to leverage his release, and he does it successfully. My understanding is that the Russian government was pressuring the Czech government pretty heavily. Our government tried to pressure back or try to urge the Czechs to do the right thing, but they had several of their officers' lives on the line, and so the guy got released. We do not criticize or second guess our Monday morning quarterback at all of our Czech allies for what they did. We weren't in their shoes where they had several of their officers' lives on the line. They have always been phenomenal allies in the war on terror and in all sorts of law enforcement partnerships. So we don't criticize them at all for that. They were trying to do the right thing. But again, this just highlights the steps, the extent that they'll take to prevent these extraditions just highlights their interest in these criminal sources of revenue and the fear of these targets ending up in U.S. custody. I think that points to the tie between the organization and this revenue stream. Ali Kolalat in Belgium, when he was arrested in 2014, he also was plotting, as we found out through some of our intelligence, some of our source network, he was plotting the killing of the Belgian prosecutors in his case and the kidnapping of the Belgian, I think, defense attaché in Beirut. When we got wind of that, we worked with the Belgians to expedite his extradition to the U.S., and sure enough, we were able to send a plane there in the middle of the night and grab him. And I think, and I might be getting the story a little bit off here, but I think that when that happened, he was thinking that, oh, hey, yeah, it worked, I'm getting out of here and heading home, and until he heard the very thick New Jersey accent of the agent on the plane. But and I think he said "Welcome to America" or something. But so they took him to. He was extradited. These are the steps they're willing to take. They're not going to do that, and they wouldn't be able to do that without the help of the organization if this wasn't a revenue stream for them, in our opinion. There was another planned kidnapping in connection to another pending extradition, which I can't give the details of, and as I mentioned, the enormous pressure in the Morocco extradition case. So the highlighting of LH's involvement in criminal activity through these cases has great value in exposing Hezbollah's criminal activity and discrediting its leadership, who repeatedly deny involvement in criminal activity. And this, in turn, can hopefully help us with our ongoing efforts of convincing our allies to designate LH as a whole as an FTO rather than just the military wing. And finally, we also measure our success and the impact by the fallout information we receive in the wake of significant enforcement activity. Every time some of this happens, like with the Operation Cedar takedown or some of these extraditions, often in the aftermath, you'll get an indication. Again, can't explain how, but with the information that comes in afterwards, we can get an indication of the resulting lost revenue, logistical impediments, impact on morale, and discrediting of LH. A lot of times people say like, oh, well, there's no way that they're benefiting from it because Secretary General Nasrallah has specifically said that this is against their moral code. This is not condoned. This is criminal activity is immoral and against their religious beliefs. And I've used this analogy before. It almost kind of reminds me of that Office episode when Michael Scott finds out that Jan, his ex-girlfriend, cheated on him, and he says to her, "I specifically asked you not to cheat on me." So my point is, yeah, okay, Nasrallah's saying that, but he's a murdering terrorist, okay? And, the Hells Angels in Lynn, Massachusetts, they hold a toy drive, but they also murder people with hammers and sell drugs. Pablo Escobar, and I think even in the news they said the one of the Mexican cartels is doing a big toy drive at Christmas, and Pablo Escobar fed and built orphanages and all that, but he also murdered and dealt drugs, and it's a PR campaign, and sometimes they lie. So, anyway. So it should be noted that in addition to the aforementioned close working relationships with OFAC, FinCEN, CBP, we also work very closely with our IC partners and HSI. HSI, we've had some tremendous success with them, working closely, textbook model coordination, in some of these sharing intel, assisting each other with multiple indictments, arrests, and extraditions over the past 3 years. Same thing with our FBI brothers and sisters. The coordination has been textbook, where each agency brought its skill sets and resources to the table. And in the last couple of months, we've had some tremendous successes in some operations and cases that we're not at liberty to discuss yet, but hope to in the near future. But it was a lot of positive feedback from our field agents from both agencies in that. And so we're proud of that. And I think that's pretty much it.
All right. Come sit down.
Yeah.
My takeaway is the world according to Michael Scott. You said a lot of other interesting things too, but
Learned so much.
yes. So I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative, John, and ask you a few quick questions, and you can answer, quickly, and then we'll open it up to Q&A from our audience that's here in person. So the first thing I'd like to ask you about is the extent to which the issue that you touched upon briefly of the compartmentalization of Hezbollah activities across political, social, military, terrorist, criminal activity, and the resultant different ways that countries designate or don't designate or partially designate Hezbollah affects DEA's ability to work with partners. So you mentioned cases in Europe, Operation Cedar in particular, tremendous cooperation with multiple countries, a variety of cases in South America and Africa. We just had the most recent case this week of Honduras saying that they were going to designate all of Hezbollah. But if a country designates part of Hezbollah, not the rest of it, do you have situations where that makes it more difficult to cooperate in some of these criminal activities if you can't demonstrate that that the activity was in furtherance of the specifically terrorist wing of the group?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the answer would be sort of, but not really, and it's about how you package it and how you message it. So we have been in situations where in one European country we were at, we went there to brief them on per their invitation to brief them on this target set that we found was tied to Hezbollah, and we thought the criminal proceeds were going to Hezbollah coffers. And as we started the briefing, they halted us. They're like, "Whoa, we don't consider them a terrorist organization," because we're referring to it in the context, referring to Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. They're like, "They're not a terrorist organization, blah blah blah." This is, and it kind of like took it off the rails there. We subsequently realized that if you just leave out the labels and the categories. In subsequent briefings after that, when we're getting some European allies on board, for example, we would just be like, let's just call it what it is. They are drug trafficking, arms traffickers, drug traffickers, money launderers. And that's universal. Everybody wants those out of their country. So we just briefed it as, here are some criminals. This one happens to be Lebanese. This one happens to be whatever. They are dealing drugs in your country. They are then laundering the money back to South America, doing this. And when we just focused on the criminal element, that's the beauty about going after terrorism targets with other charges and other criminal investigations. You kind of just go around the whole political sensitivities and labels and nuances, and if you just package it as a criminal group you're going after, we found that was so much easier. And that way it gives the officers that we're working with kind of plausible deniability, and because if they have to answer to politicians, they don't need to say, hey, look, these are terrorists. However, they're calling them a terrorist organization. However, they just go to them and say, hey, look, DEA came and brought us this criminal organization, and here's how we can get into it. Here's the intelligence, and we go forward from there and kind of leave the labeling out. Now, I will say that in addition to that, like in the Operation Cedar case, the French law enforcement and a lot of the other Europol members were phenomenal in speaking to the agents that were on the ground there. They were phenomenal, and like with a lot of things, when you're in the trenches, with your fellow, and I found this in Spain too when I was there, when you're working with fellow cops on a criminal case, it doesn't matter if like their government hates George Bush at the time or they have some, if they have some real radical leftists or whatever, because the presidents come and go. But you develop this relationship with them, a friendship with them, and the politics are set aside and you're going after the start. That was kind of the same thing in the Cedar case. They didn't care about what all the politics were on labeling and designating and all that. They said, these guys are bad guys, let's go after them. And now, where it did get kind of, the reason I say sort of is where it did get sort of, iffy was after the takedown and all the press releases were being prepared. We wanted to highlight the very close ties to Hezbollah that were there, especially through Mohammed Noureddin, et cetera, and in order to discredit the organization, expose them, et cetera. And I think there were some, of our European allies at the political level that preferred not to do that or to nuance it more. So in the messaging part there, it was a little bit.
I was asking specifically because of Operation Cedar. In the end, the French actually used the word Hezbollah in some of the legal documents. That got some attention. Then they stopped, and that's been an ongoing issue in terms of after the fact, even though it's a closed case, a conviction, being able to get access to those court documents has been difficult, I think, because of this issue.
Yeah, and I think their system is different too. Like here, court documents are total public record.
Yeah. One more question before we open it up to everybody. You talked about this logistical procurement and financing element. At one point, the U.S. government, DEA, and others used to refer to this as the business affairs component, as a term that kind of we gave to them, not knowing what they called themselves. And when DEA exposed this, DEA revealed that this was set up by Imad Mughniya himself, together with others, Adam Tabaja and Abdallah Safiuddin, in large part to create a source of revenue for Hezbollah's, specifically terrorist Islamic Jihad organization, external security organization, and other activities. It ties into current events, by the way, because I think you well know that when Mughniya was assassinated in February 2008, that was put on hold a little bit because originally he was there with Qasem Soleimani. And the decision then was taken not to target Qasem Soleimani, and only Mughniya was assassinated back then in February 2008. Now, of course, things change, and Qasem Soleimani has been designated. But I want to take this opportunity to ask you about this logistical financial procurement entity of Hezbollah's activities, not only for itself, but in the service of and on behalf of Iran. And ways in which maybe they're called upon to do things for Iran, or when they have an opportunity to procure something, they say, hey, I'm thinking of the Iman Kubaisi case, who was arrested in Atlanta. She was saying to people, according to the court documents, well, actually, Iran might have interest in getting these types of things. I could get some of this stuff for Hezbollah, but I could get some of this stuff for Iran. How much overlap is there within this Hezbollah component in terms of activities that they'll be doing specifically for the Quds Force or other parts of Iran?
So a lot of our investigations and intelligence does point to a sort of overlapping of Iranian and Hezbollah benefiting from this criminal activity. And we've also seen an uptick in IRGC-related criminal activity as they face the strains that I'd mentioned in my presentation with the proxy wars and the sanctions. So, I can't really get into specifics, but yes, we have seen that in our investigations where the criminal support network criminal activity for Hezbollah does also benefit Iran, based on our assessment.
Okay, great. So I'll start with Mike Kraft. I saw you, and we'll get to everybody.
Following up that question.
Can you just wait? I'm sorry. If you could just wait for the microphone.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. On the financial aspects, do you have any estimate of what percentage or the amount of revenues that Hezbollah gains from its narcotics-related activities? And what percentage of their, shall we say, their budget comes from narcotics as opposed to support from Iran?
So I don't have numbers for that, and we've been asked that before, and it's kind of a hard number to figure out. However, in some public conferences and briefings I've been in, I had heard the number of amount of funding they get from Iran, for example, to be around 80% of their funding. So, I mean, just doing the math there. I've also heard that the criminal revenue being as low as by some analysis being as low as maybe 10%. But again, it's a very rough guess on a lot of people's parts. Our position is it doesn't really matter if it's any percent, and we have a role as a drug enforcement agency. If we have a role in stopping any percent of it, that can be our contribution to the overall USG effort against this whole network.
Right.
I know it's not that good of an answer.
Rob? Right.
Thank you, Rob Satloff, the director of the Institute. Thank you very much. This is really fascinating. Given your knowledge of Hezbollah's global network, can you give us an evaluation of Hezbollah's capabilities here inside the United States? Do you feel as though you know the whole iceberg, the tip of the iceberg? What do you think Hezbollah is capable of here in the United States? Do they have sleeper cells here in the States, for example?
Yeah, you know what? Since that's not my expertise, I would hate to step into the lane of our FBI partners who are focused on that. I mean, that's their mandate. The pure terror, the purely terrorism threat side of it. So I would defer to them on that, and I apologize.
So, but in just the criminal activity side of it, how central is activity here in the United States to what Hezbollah does in that realm?
So we know that, for example, a lot of the criminal activity touches the U.S. I mentioned to you that there are some indictments involving large-scale cocaine shipments being sent to the U.S. In conjunction with the Colombians by Hezbollah, actually members, affiliates that are drug traffickers as well. And in the Ali Shamas extradition from Paraguay that we did, I think it was 2016, he was charged in connection with large cocaine shipments to the U.S., Europe, and Africa. So we know that they're involved in trafficking coke here, whether it's as a transshipment broker or as a supplier. And then also the financial part. They use a lot of the money laundering they do hits on U.S. financial institutions and banks. And also the used car money laundering, the trade-based money laundering scheme that I was talking about through West Africa. All those ships, all those cars were sent out, out of New Jersey on giant ships all the way over there. And that was part of that whole scheme where it was part of the masking of the drug proceeds coming out of Europe. So they relied heavily on the used car industry in the U.S. So, I give those as a couple examples. But, their criminal activity here, money, it's involved in their money laundering, it's involved in their drug trafficking. As far as any sleeper cells and terror plots, I would defer to FBI to answer that.
The only downside to having U.S. government officials speak at these events is that they can be, committed to their lane. If someone like John speaks to something like the FBI, they can get quite upset. I'm not bound by that anymore. I'm out of government. So while I don't like the term sleeper cell very much, I'll just note that in the recent case of Ali Karani in New York, who was convicted and sentenced to 40 years, he described himself as a sleeper cell. And when asked by the FBI under what circumstances he thought he or others like him might be called upon to act on the surveillance he was carrying out targeting FBI, Secret Service, U.S. military, Israelis in New York, searching out places where he could procure small arms, etc. His answer was, well, I assume if something was done targeting Hezbollah or Iran or their senior leadership, which is why current events make this timely question and conversation. Of course, Ali Karni wasn't the only recent arrest. Samuel Debek, Ali Saab, as you heard intimated, there's likely going to be other, hopefully, indictments coming in the not terribly distant future. Right here, please. Yeah. Yona? Just wait for the mic.
Here you go, sir.
Thank you. Jon Alexander. Thank you very much again for focusing on the network, the criminal network. My question to you is, can you address the issue of the so-called Middle East or Lebanese diaspora, particularly focusing on the family network and their impact on the criminal activity. And secondly, what's the role of legitimate business organizations that are involved? And finally, coming back to the question about Iran, whether the activity of the Iranian embassies around the world in this connection.
I'm sorry, what was the last part?
The role of Iranian embassies in some of the illicit conduct.
Yeah, so as far as the diaspora, Lebanon is one of those countries like as you guys know, like Italy and Ireland, where historically they've established communities all over the world, and so like with any sector, a lot of times criminal elements from that originating country will seek out the diasporas in order to, because they have that natural connection or whatever. The role of families, you mean like you're talking about like the family networks then being involved in the criminal activity? Is that what you're saying, sir?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we have seen that. Just like with any criminal organizations, a lot of times they'll use family networks, family businesses to further their criminal activity. We've seen that in the tri-border area. We've seen that in Europe. So, I mean, I don't know if that's answering your question. As far as the role of Iranian embassies, yes, we have seen information and we have received intelligence on embassies being used in furtherance of criminal activity. I remember one incident a while back. I can't say like where or whatever, but what country it was in. But yeah, diplomatic pouches were being used through the Iranian embassy to actually move narcotics, because it would bypass a lot of the customs controls, for example. I don't know how prevalent that is or how extensive that is. That one example I'm referring to is from a few years back, but yes, there has been some indications of that.
Great. Josh?
Hi, Josh Meyer, journalist. I wanted to follow up on a question that Matt asked, which is the overlap between the criminal support network of Hezbollah and Iran, IRGC, Quds Force. So this also goes into the Ali Fayyad case, but can you just provide some more detail, whatever you can, under the circumstances, about their support for arms, weapons, fighters also? Like, how much of this money is going towards helping Syria, Iraq, proxy forces in those areas? And does the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, how does that fit into this whole thing? How much of the money that Hezbollah has been raising is going towards funding their efforts in the Middle East?
Again, like with the other question about percentages of funds, I couldn't tell you how much, but we have seen in some of our investigations indications of Hezbollah criminal activity also benefiting their Iranian masters, and an increase in what appears to be an increase in IRGC criminal activity, like drug trafficking, etc. You were asking about Soleimani.
Helping influence the events and contributing to Syria and Iraq.
Yeah, so Ali Fayyad, as I was mentioning, and as you mentioned, he was involved in shipping arms down to LH forces that were fighting in Syria, and we had another more recent case where drug proceeds, the evidence was showing drug proceeds is being used to purchase arms extensively to also be shipped down to Syria, and that was after Fayyad was doing it, without getting into other details.
If you look at some of the Treasury designations that accompanied some of these DEA activities, many of which are based on interagency, but including DEA evidence, you'll see a common thread I know others have written about of drug money being used to finance the purchase of weapons specifically for the fight in Syria. Right here, please, middle, and then we'll go to Jeff.
Hi, thanks for being here today. Jerry Dunleavy with the Washington Examiner. So you mentioned earlier that we are all aware of sort of the controversy surrounding Project Cassandra during the Obama administration, the lead up to the Iran deal. And you mentioned that the Trump administration is stepping up efforts. Are you able to just describe how, if at all, the approach of the Trump administration to going after Hezbollah is different over the last 2 years than it had been prior?
So I think that the as Dr. Levitt has mentioned in the past, I think it's it's not like a black and white issue like you say, like this this administration totally screwed up and everything they did was wrong, and I think that there were a lot of our good investigations were being conducted during the previous administration because we're following criminal evidence and doing that. However, I don't think it's. I think it's safe to say that under the previous administration, it was not prioritized as the threat that President Trump has prioritized it as. And as I mentioned in my presentation, the President Trump's approach on it has been on a comprehensive scale, hitting it from every resource and every tool and every authority that the U.S. government has, not just military, not just intelligence community, but law enforcement as well, like us and CBP and FinCEN and Treasury. And so I think that more robust approach has had a bigger effect and a bigger impact on the overall criminal network. So I think that it has had a better, more positive effect for national security.
Jeff in the back.
Jeff Selden with VOA. Thanks very much for doing this. I was wondering how much sway or influence are Hezbollah's criminal activities around the world giving Hezbollah in Iran in those communities, in those countries where they're operating? And have you seen any sort of lasting impact from that influence even after there are operations that take down portions of the criminal network or end some of the criminal activities?
I'm sorry. Could you repeat that question?
Sure. Just wondering, with the criminal activity that Hezbollah is involved in, whether it's the arms trafficking, the drugs trafficking, when they're in these other countries doing this activity in communities in those countries, how much influence do they end up having beyond the fact that they're making money and they're profiting from this and able to send some of it back? How much influence, how much sway do they end up holding in these areas? And does that extend beyond when perhaps the initial criminal activity is stopped or somehow these networks are, at least for a while, dismantled?
You mean like influence with the community, like political influence?
Political influence, even being able to just coerce people within the community to follow a certain line or engage in certain activities?
Yeah, I'm not really familiar with that aspect. I can't really. I'm not very knowledgeable to speak to that, but I do know that it does depend on the place. Like, definitely in Lebanon, you saw through the OFAC designations of parliamentary members Sherry and Rod, all sorts of coercion, threats, on banking officials and their family members, et cetera, threats of violence in order to get what they want for LH. So obviously there. But and then maybe at a lesser extent, but more than other places in the tri-border area, I think that because of the extensive and historical presence there, they do hold more sway over maybe corrupt Paraguayan officials or other members of the community. Although I have to say that with Paraguay, we've had a fantastic partnership with the Paraguayan police there and the Paraguayan government in a lot of these successful cases we've had. But maybe less so they would probably have less sway in European places where they're working. I can't really speak to what the effects are, but I would imagine that it depends on where they are and how big their community is.
Let me take the opportunity to follow up, because one of the questions I have down here is to ask you, and you just mentioned the designations in Lebanon of these two parliamentarians, and the pressure they were putting on banks to open and maintain accounts, and telling banks that they would be opening accounts under their personal names when in fact they were for servicing designated Hezbollah entities. So many of the cases that have come out over the past few years are at least in part the result of continuing to pull the strings of the Lebanese Canadian bank, the LCB case that DEA and others were so involved in. And recently we had the designation of another bank, Jamal Trust Bank, in Lebanon. Can you speak a little bit to the extent to which this Hezbollah criminal activity ends up coming back to Lebanon itself and to the Lebanese financial system? How much of a risk is this criminal activity that Hezbollah engages in a risk for the Lebanese financial system back home?
Well, I think that now, and even in the news, you're seeing like the extensive unrest and growing frustration of the Lebanese public about over this massive and complete corruption throughout the government, largely because of the Hezbollah influence and the Hezbollah criminal activity. It seems like it's reaching a boiling point, actually, in a lot of ways. And the years and years of corruption and the intimidation and the extortion and all that by Hezbollah thugs it's almost like it's coming to roost. So you saw with, like, for example, the Wafiq Safa designation, using their positions and their connections with security forces to get contraband through port entrances, facilitating the movement of Hezbollah members and people through these ports of entry, using Hezbollah's threat of force, violence, and intimidation. I think that all of it has just been coming to a boiling point, and you're now starting to see the absolute frustration among the Lebanese people with they're tired of all the corruption, and a lot of it comes from Hezbollah. And some analysts were telling me from some of the other agencies that you'll see a lot of these rallies on TV where the flags are handed out, the Hezbollah flags are handed out, and these protests and all that, but when you speak to these people after the cameras are gone and the demonstration's over, they're frustrated. A lot of them can't stand Hezbollah. They feel bullied and intimidated by them, and they're basically it's a facade. So I don't know if that really.
You mentioned Wafiq Safa, who's a very prominent Hezbollah security official, and another very prominent Hezbollah official who's come up in a lot of these criminal cases is Abdullah Safiuddin. Can you speak a little bit to the extent to which kind of senior established Hezbollah figures, political or otherwise, come up in your investigations? And how does that factor into the debate you were talking about earlier during your opening remarks about where one assesses this criminal activity to rest within Hezbollah? In other words, is this just some people who support Hezbollah and are doing crime on their own and are giving donations to Hezbollah? If they were doctors or lawyers, it would be from that income, but they're criminals, so it comes from that income? Or is there something more organized within Hezbollah? What does it mean when you see the Wafiq Safas or the Abdullah Safiuddins coming up in your cases?
Yeah, so Wafiq Safa and Abdullah Safiuddin, we have seen information and indicators in our investigations, evidence in our investigations of their involvement in criminal activity, as far as giving green light on certain activity, turning a blind eye, or as I mentioned as a designation explained with Wafiq Safa, actively overseeing and participating in directing criminal activity. whether that's money laundering, giving the okay for laundering money for certain criminal groups, or moving contraband through ports of entry. So Safi al-Din and Wafik Safa, yeah, we've seen information without getting into detail on that. For Nasrallah, again, as I mentioned with the analogy I used, they, I can't, speak to, in this forum, to, evidence of his, involvement or conniving or whatever. But I will say that with an organization that is proven to be, as violent or as intimidating or as coercing as they want to be, if they're saying on, if Nasrallah is saying at a public level that they don't condone criminal activity, this is not condoned by LH, this is it's immoral, whatever. Yet, and they have the ability to do their own internal investigations, which they have done for people that they thought were going awry or going against or destroying the image of the organization. They could easily police their own and rein them in and punish them, etc. But they don't. And the only reasonable explanation for that is, well, they're not going to, because they're bringing the money in. That in addition to the fact that at the very least, maybe Nasrallah turning a blind eye or being directly involved. I can't speak to that right here, but we know that if he really wanted to clean up his house or whatever and rein these people in and punish them, he could, and he doesn't. So
Okay. Haneen on the side.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating, and especially the part on the Lebanon protests and the opinions on Hezbollah. I've been following this very closely. I'm Lebanese, and I've been following this closely, and I completely agree with you. My question is that since Hezbollah's financial crisis increased because of the sanctions on Iran, there have been a lot more smuggling activities from Lebanon to Syria to Iraq and further into the Gulf, apparently. Can you elaborate a little bit further on these routes, and if Iraq actually has become one of the hubs of the Shia crescent in terms of the criminal activities, and what kind of routes are happening around that area? Thank you.
We've received information and are following up on information on extensive drug trafficking, smuggling routes being used by and protected by Hezbollah elements, not just in Lebanon, but also in like you said, a lot of the countries in the Shia Crescent, including Syria. Some of the reporting that we've seen from even non-governmental sources is that there is an extensive permeation of drug trafficking of all sorts, Captagon, marijuana-based drugs throughout Syria, and being trafficked by not just Hezbollah, but also Syrian military intelligence. And in some of the reports we saw that it was so pervasive and so back and forth and just totally destroying a lot of the remaining legitimate elements of the Syrian communities and military, that even one senior Syrian military officer lamented, it seemed like almost in tears, at how the country was just being ravaged and the military bearing and tradition and dignity being totally being destroyed by this criminal activity. It was just totally rotting their whole system. And Hezbollah, they're talking about Hezbollah protecting, a lot of these trafficking routes through. And remember, the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon is known for a lot of its Captagon production. A lot of that being ending up in nightclubs in Saudi Arabia, for example. So, like I said before, when it comes to the bottom line. It doesn't matter about sectarian differences. So yes, it is so pervasive, and some of these reports that we're reading, it was amazing how pervasive it is in Iraq, Syria, and Hezbollah as their other funding streams were drying up.
So if I may, there have been a variety of kind of fairly new efforts to help enhance cooperation on targeting Hezbollah's criminal and terrorist activities. And one of them that seems to me to be among the most successful is the Law Enforcement Coordination Group, the LECG, which is this kind of U.S. State Department led, it's not only the State Department, but DOJ and State Department, meetings around the world, bringing together law enforcement specifically from countries around the world to share their experiences, share some recent cases, share recent modus operandi. Can you talk a little bit to how that type of a framework helps your work?
Yeah, actually, the LECG has been really great for our efforts. Some of my guys on my team have been to LECGs in Europe and South America and elsewhere, and in addition to presenting the cases and learning about trends and patterns of how these networks work, as you know, with any conference, the real work gets done outside of like the conference, when people start exchanging business cards and they start talking a lot. And without fail, at all these conferences, the several counterparts have come up to us from different countries, and a lot of times countries that we hadn't worked with before, and have said, "Hey, we have a whole group of Lebanese criminals or criminal organization that happen to be Lebanese that we haven't seen any ties to Hezbollah or whatever, but would you mind taking a look at some of our intel and seeing if you see it?" Because they didn't know to look for that. They just, and sure enough, we'll run some of the selectors, some of the numbers, and do some workup for them. And sure enough, you're seeing it tied to different Hezbollah-run networks in Europe or the Middle East or Africa. And they're right there because of this conference. You've now illuminated this network on things they didn't see or they didn't know to look for. Just like us, we didn't know to look for that connection before the guys in Miami did Operation Titan in 2007. So yeah, the real benefits are after those lectures, people getting together.
Excellent. Please join me in thanking John for taking the time to come out and meet with us today. Thank you all for taking the time to come in person, and those who are watching on TV or on our live stream, thank you very much. Have a great day.